I'm Nick, and you're watching Signal Ditch. If you follow me on Twitter, you may have noticed over the past month or so that I've developed, I guess you could call it, a problem. I just can't buy enough tubes. I've tried, I keep buying more tubes, but it's never enough. I can't help it, they're just so delicious and crunchy. But that's not my real problem. My real problem is that they're a limited resource. The world is running out of tubes, and that's because nobody makes them. That's an exaggeration. There are still companies that make vacuum tubes. There are, of course, factories that make tubes for high-powered RF applications where tubes are still used pretty regularly. Things like magnetrons, klystrons, and traveling wave tubes, for instance. And there are other vacuum devices that are still used in industry and research, such as photomultiplier tubes and Bayard-Alpert ion gauges. But usually, when we say vacuum tube, we mean a device like this. A small diode, triode, or pentode like you might find in a guitar amplifier, a hi-fi stereo unit, or a ham radio. Now, these are becoming very rare indeed. Now, don't get me wrong, you can still get used working tubes and even new old stock tubes from warehouses and radio repair shops all over the place. But they are running out, and the popular tubes for audio applications are running out faster than anything else. There are only a handful of factories that are still making these tubes. And when I say a handful, I mean you could probably count them on two hands. There are 5 major factories that make commercially available brand new vacuum tubes that you could go out and purchase right now. There's JJ in the Slovak Republic, SED and Expo PUL in Russia, and then Shuguang and PS Vane in China. And that's about it. There are probably other smaller factories who are making short runs of specialty tubes and things like the budget tubes that you might find in a cheap headphone amplifier on Alibaba. The audio tube shortage has actually become such a big deal that Western Electric in the US has announced plans to reopen their Georgia tube plant. Now, if you get outside of the realm of audio tubes, it gets even spottier. Noritake in Japan, and probably a handful of other companies, are still making vacuum fluorescent displays, especially the segmented style found in microwaves and car stereos. You might find a factory that's still making cathode ray tubes for precision instruments like oscilloscopes, but those are getting fewer and farther between. There are a few companies that refurbish CRTs, but they mainly do it for museums. And as far as I know, there's only one company in the entire world who's still making commercially available brand new Nixie tubes, and that's Dalibor Farny's company in the Czech Republic. If you haven't seen his YouTube channel, by the way, you should definitely check it out. So where does that leave someone like me who can't get enough tubes? Well, I'm just gonna have to learn to make my own. So how am I gonna do that? Well, before we can talk about how vacuum tubes are built, we need to understand a little bit about how vacuum tubes work. There are already plenty of YouTube videos that explain this concept better than I can, so I'll give you the broad strokes, and if you're interested in learning more, I highly recommend the series of videos called Vacuum Tube Logic on the Usagi Electric YouTube channel. Generally speaking, vacuum tubes operate by emitting electrons from one surface called a cathode and collecting them on another surface called the anode. In between the two, you may have one or several elements that are designed to manipulate that stream of electrons. These are things like grids, deflection plates, and even electromagnets. All of this depends on the ability of a charged particle to move relatively unimpeded through open space, and you can't do that if all of these elements are crowded by gas molecules. In some situations, particular gas molecules are actually desirable, such as the neon in a Nixie tube, or the argon in a rectifier tube. But even in these so-called gas-filled tubes, the pressure is much, much lower than atmospheric pressure, thus the vacuum in vacuum tube. So what does the tube do? Well, it keeps the vacuum in, or more accurately, it keeps the atmosphere out. Thus, we can imagine that a vacuum tube is made up of three basic parts, the first being the active elements, those conductive parts that actually emit, collect, or deflect charged particles. The second being the glass or sometimes metal envelope that surrounds and supports those elements, and the third being the rarefied atmosphere inside of that envelope. In this way, the construction of a vacuum tube can be generally understood to break down into three separate domains, which I'll be calling build, blow, and suck. During the build phase, the active elements in the tube are assembled and then attached to a tube base, which also acts as the electrical pass-through from the surrounding atmosphere to the vacuum inside the tube. The active elements in a vacuum tube are almost exclusively made out of metal, and the properties of these metals have a profound impact on the longevity and operation of the tube. Tungsten is often used in the form of wire and rod, both as a vacuum pass-through material because it has a similar thermal coefficient of expansion to borosilicate glass, but also as a hot filament material because it has a relatively high melting point. Sometimes they'll add thorium to the tungsten to lower its work function, and this thoriated tungsten wire is often used in filaments which are acting as directly heated cathodes. Although tungsten can be sealed to borosilicate glass, there are other alloys of metal which are specifically formulated for the purpose. One such alloy is Kovar. Kovar was formulated mainly for its mechanical properties and not so much its electrical properties, so it's almost exclusively used directly at the glass-metal interface, and then a more suitable metal is welded to it to actually create the elements on top. In vacuum tubes that use soda-lime glass for the envelope, instead of a hard glass like borosilicate, copper metal can actually be used to create the hermetic glass-to-metal seal. There's a specific formulation of copper wire which is pre-oxidized for this purpose called Dumet. A Dumet seal can be recognized by its characteristic red-orange color. Pure oxygen-free copper is also used in active elements of the tube, often in situations where its high thermal conductivity comes in handy, such as on plate anodes or on the heat sinks for X-ray targets. Nickel, iron, titanium, molybdenum, stainless steel, barium, and other metals can all be used in the construction of active elements in vacuum tubes. Chemical coatings may also be used in making the active elements. Cathode coatings, for instance, are a combination of barium, strontium, and calcium compounds that lower the work function of a cathode. Phosphors may be used in any vacuum device that needs to emit light. And high-temperature electrical insulators like alumina are often used to keep filaments from shorting out against indirectly heated cathodes. The active elements in vacuum tubes are almost exclusively assembled by spot welding, except in situations where crimping or bending will suffice, or where the element itself wouldn't survive being welded, like is the case with superfine filament wire. With the active elements assembled and attached to the tube base, we've now entered the blow stage of the three-stage process. In this stage, we shape the glass envelope that's going to surround and support the active elements. This is basically scientific glass blowing, and it uses most of the same tools and materials, namely extruded glass tubing. Many commercially produced vacuum tubes, especially older ones, were made with soda-lime glass. Soda-lime is a soft glass with a low melting point, and it was basically the only game in town before borosilicate. While the lower melting point may seem appealing from a hobbyist perspective, it's much weaker than borosilicate glass, and, crucially, much less tolerant to thermal shock. This makes it harder to work and necessitates long annealing cycles to keep your work from cracking after you've finished it. This susceptibility to thermal shock is actually what gives early tubes their characteristic bulb shape, because you needed to keep the glass envelope far away from any elements that might heat up during operation so you didn't crack the glass. Today, most vacuum devices are made out of borosilicate glass because it's stronger, easier to work with, and more resistant to temperature shock. Conveniently, borosilicate glass is also great for making pipes and bongs for smoking weed, and with that industry taking off, borosilicate glass tubing is easier to come by than ever. The bare minimum tooling that you need to work with borosilicate glass is basically an oxygen fuel torch and some sort of graphite poking tool. Graphite is used in glassworking tools to keep it from sticking to the hot glass, which steel tools can often do. It's also helpful to have an oven that you can anneal the glass in to remove any stress that you may have imparted during the glassworking. Finally, a glass-blowing lathe makes it possible to do much more complex glass-blowing operations, and we'll talk about that more in a moment. Once you have all of the active elements attached to a base, which is attached to a glass envelope, we can move on to the third stage, the suck. To pull all of the gas molecules out of our vacuum tube, we're going to need a pump. In the case of neon and other gas-filled tubes that operate at a higher pressure than electron tubes, you can actually evacuate those using a mechanical pump like a dual-stage rotary pump or even a diaphragm pump. Both of these types of pumps will achieve an ultimate vacuum in the neighborhood of 10 to 100 torr pretty easily. Unfortunately, electron tubes operate at a pressure that's orders of magnitude below this, in the neighborhood of 10 to the minus 6 torr. These vacuum pressures are only achievable using a dedicated high vacuum pump like an oil diffusion pump or a turbomolecular pump, and we'll talk more about those in another video all about vacuum systems. Once you've sucked all of the gas molecules out of your tube and you close it off, there are still going to be some molecules which are left adsorbed onto the surface of the active elements or the glass envelope itself, and those molecules will escape into the atmosphere of the tube over time as the tube heats up and is used. The pressure inside the tube can actually increase to the point where it stops working correctly. Plus, if these gas molecules are something like oxygen, they can damage the active elements in the tube by oxidizing them, especially elements that get hot, like filaments. To collect and sequester that oxygen, which has evolved over the life of the tube, we use a material called a getter. In the case of vacuum tubes, a getter is a metal alloy that gets vaporized and deposited on the inside of the glass envelope of the tube after it's sealed. This evaporation of the getter material, known as flashing the getter, is sometimes achieved by a dedicated filament, but more often than not it happens through the glass of the tube using induction heating. Popular getter materials include barium, strontium, aluminum, and titanium, and in the case of neon tubes, a little bit of mercury may be added as well. With the tube assembled and pumped down and the getter flashed, it's ready for operation. So let's have a look at the tools that I'm going to need to assemble to do this in the home lab. Here's a basic list of all the tools I've identified that I'll need before I'll be able to make a working vacuum tube. Again, I've arranged these by their position in the build, blow, suck process. In the build stage, besides a few basic hand tools, I'll need a spot welder to weld all of the metal elements together, I'll need an induction heater to flash the getter, and I'll need some basic lab glass for things like washing, coating, and etching. In the blow phase, I'm going to need some torches, both oxygen fuel torches for the actual glass work and Bunsen burners for annealing. I'll also need gas cylinders to supply those torches, and some basic glassworking tools to manipulate the glass while it's hot. My life would be a lot easier if I had a glass lathe and an annealing oven as well. Finally, the suck phase. This is all about the vacuum pumps. We'll need a mechanical pump as a roughing pump for our high vacuum pump. We'll need a high vacuum pump to actually achieve the vacuum levels needed for vacuum tube operation. We'll need various gauges to measure the vacuum levels, we'll need plumbing to plumb all of these things together, and we'll need valves so that we can isolate certain parts of the vacuum system from others to protect the pumps and our tube. And that's pretty much it. So what do I have so far? Well, I already had things like basic hand tools and lab glass, and I even have some torches and Bunsen burners that I think are going to be appropriate for glassworking. I've designed a home-built glass lathe, which I'm in the process of building right now, and I'll release the plans for that lathe as an open-source hardware project as soon as I can verify that it works. Keep your eyes out for a YouTube video on that project in the near future. I've also collected almost the entire vacuum system. The centerpiece of the system is an Edwards EXT255H turbomolecular pump. This is backed with a cheap 2-stage mechanical HVAC service pump from Harbor Freight. Just the other day, I was able to assemble enough of the system to actually test the turbo pump for the first time, and within about half an hour, we were already dropping down through 10 to the minus 5 millibar. This is pretty good, and I think that we can get even better with proper cleaning and bake out of the finished system. I'll spare you the details for now, because I'm already working on another video all about the vacuum system. So what is all of this actually for? What kinds of vacuum tubes do I plan on making? A little bit of everything, honestly, and even some things that haven't been made before. See, for a while, I've been making and posting these photorealistic renders of vacuum tube devices from a parallel world where semiconductors never really caught on, and we were forced to continue to integrate and miniaturize vacuum tubes so that we could have the sort of technology that we enjoy today. I call this project Integrated Thermionic, after the fictitious manufacturer of these devices. Basically, I view this as a sculptural extension of that project. Some of the devices that I designed were actually physically plausible, and so I want to find out if they work. These devices run the gamut from triodes and pentodes to VFDs and CRTs, even beam deflection tubes and magnetrons. I've also developed an interest in thermionic energy converters, basically vacuum tube solar cells. I'm hoping to develop an accessible method for building low-cost, low-yield solar thermionic converters as my entry for the Hackaday Prize this year. And finally, I want to develop the idea that I had for a device called a planar element multivalve, which is basically like if Noritake had developed the Compactron. These are stacks of flat elements with layers of interconnect in the same envelope to create highly integrated devices, things like monolithic op amps and logic elements. And of course, I'm always open to suggestions. Thanks for sticking around to the end of the video. I know that it's cliche, but if you like the video, go ahead and give it a like. And if you want to stay up to date on what I'm doing here in the Tube Lab, you can hit subscribe. You can also join my Patreon if you feel like throwing me a couple bucks. Not gonna lie, it would really help me out. All patrons will get early access to the YouTube videos, and triode level patrons will get their names at the end of the YouTube videos. The Patreon is also the best way to get in touch with me if you have any interesting ideas about tubes or tube making. You can find all of that at www.patreon.com/integratedtherm. Now I'm going to put a bunch of YouTube channels on the screen and also link them in the description. These are all YouTube channels that I'd like to thank because they helped me out immensely in getting this far. I'd especially like to thank all of the creators who are making videos showing the process of making vacuum tubes. There aren't many people doing it, and there are even fewer people filming it, so every second of video footage that I could get my hands on was a huge help. Ron Soyland, aka Glasslinger on YouTube, has been immensely helpful and has an entire channel just chock full of video of him making tubes in his home shop. Dalibor Farný is extremely transparent about his process of designing and building brand new Nixie tubes. jdflyback is what you might call a young upstart in the world of homemade vacuum tubes. They've made some very impressive devices given the tools that they're working with. P&C Electronics doesn't really explain their videos, but if you know what you're looking at, it's incredibly helpful video to have. And of course, I've watched FilmesJP's video of Claude Paillard building a tube in his home shop probably 1,000 times. I also want to give a special thanks to Ben Krasnow at Applied Science, whose content has been incredibly helpful to me not just in this project, but in a bunch of projects over the years. He doesn't make vacuum tubes on his channel, but he has built various vacuum systems, and his videos about those have been extremely helpful. If you have any interest in making vacuum tubes or just finding out how vacuum tubes are made, I encourage you to check out all of these channels, and again, I'll link them in the description. Once again, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next update.